on aesthetic taste as such. As a man is, so he sees. As the eye is formed, such art's powers. The eye altering alters all. By William Blake. The header image of this post is itself a test of taste. Goya's Saturn devouring his son on the left, and Julia Lama's Saturn devouring his child on the right. Not far behind is the opening quote, which puts forth the general thesis of what shall follow, that the limit of our concrete being is the limit of our capacities of perception of what exists, and in this particular case, the capacity to perceive beauty. There is a very obvious misunderstanding that can arise here, one which mistakes Blake's quote as one stating the relative nature of beauty, when it just as strongly states the relative nature of the perceiver of beauty. If beauty is indeed objective, why is it that it does not appear to all of us? The matter of the objectivity of beauty cannot be satisfactorily developed here, for the explanation concerns both what objectivity itself is, as well as how beauty and the tasting subject have its form and more, but some preliminary reasons are given in another post, aesthetic objectivity, some intimations, towards why such a claim should not be rejected outright. The proper placing and relating of the concept of aesthetic taste to beauty requires at least this much, for what I shall say, to make some minimal sense. A general notion of the measure of beauty is also of some necessity, for the measure of taste in relation to beauty concerns what is called the idea. All that is here is, I hope it is clear, not final. This concerns my thought process on these issues, a thought process which is my personal exercise to develop my cognition and depth of inquiry. If a reader finds this to be interesting, or better yet, to spur them to think further, it is all that I could hope to come from this work. If beauty be the object, aesthetic taste in the creator and appreciator is part of its subject, the power and activity of its determination. Within the work of art, creator and appreciator find this to be perfectly united within themselves and within the work of art, for in the artist the beautiful brings itself into actuality through what seems a self-creation via inspiration, and in the appreciator the beautiful shows itself as an independent object that from within seems to develop itself necessarily into its appearance. Once complete, we can hardly imagine it could be otherwise than what it is. Taste as such. Quote, but it remains ever the case that every man apprehends works of art or characters, actions, and events according to the measure of his insight and his feelings, and since the development of taste only touched on what was external and meager, and besides took its prescriptions likewise from an only narrow range of works of art and a limited training of the intellect and the feelings, its scope was unsatisfactory and incapable of grasping the inner meaning and truth of art, and sharpening the eye for detecting these things. Unquote. By Hegel from the Lectures on Fine Art, Volume 1, page 16. To clarify and simplify what Hegel states here, taste cannot be the measure of beauty. Aesthetic taste is conditioned, it is relative, by many contingent factors which weigh it down and cannot let it rise to proper and true universality. A person's mood, their general intellectual background, their individual contingent positive and negative associations, their acquaintance and habituation with individual works and general styles of culture, all of these inform one's aesthetic taste. It does not mean, however, that taste cannot have universal leanings. This shall be expanded later on. Taste as such is, upon little reflection, not a concept that properly belongs to aesthetics as such. Certainly there is aesthetic taste, but this is already a qualification and determination of taste as such. And if we wish to explain aesthetic taste, we must turn to taste itself sooner than later. Taste seems to belong to the domain of desire, but taste and desire are not the same thing. They do not even seem to share a horizontal relation, such as that between desire and its object, satisfaction. In some sense, one may even conceive that taste grounds desire and satisfaction. That is, taste is the structure of desire in its object. Such a conception is not even alien to us. Do we not commonly conceive desire and satisfaction to express the nature of the subject's taste? Why does so-and-so like such and such so much? They just have a taste for it. Taste is something we appeal to as an explanation for desires and their satisfactions. The structure and dynamic of this is the following. Desire, satisfaction are united in taste. That is, taste is the total dynamic process of desiring and satisfaction. Taste is the genetic source of desire and its satisfaction. Much of the following line of inquiry shall concern taste in light of desire and vice versa, for the question of interest here is about why aesthetic taste can differ on the recognition of beauty if indeed beauty is objective. Assuming that beauty has a valid objective form, though it is not reduced to a soulless or heartless object, I argue that the objectivity of aesthetic taste is a mirror of beauty's objectivity, which is itself a concrete form of the idea's own objectivity. Beauty is, therefore, a continuum of discrete and discrete order, in which a subject's own actualization of the idea sets the limit of the conception and vision of beauty. The idea as such. In Hegel's system, the meaning of the highest recollective standpoint is also the meaning of freedom, truth, or the idea. The freedom of the idea concerns its absolute unconditioned status. It is entirely self-determined. The truth of the idea concerns its self-correspondence or accord between its intelligible or rational concept and its objective embodiment. This is concretely the process of self-creation, self-realization, or self-embodiment of the subjectively ideal, the concept, at one and the same time as the objectively ideal, for example, material body, which is exemplified by the development and growth of an organism. The idea as such is the absolute of the world as principle, end, purpose, and becoming. Anything that is actual and not a mere happenstance passing appearance is ideal and a part of the idea of the universe of existence as a whole. Things can, therefore, be more or less ideal when compared to the level of freedom or truth they actually achieve. The self that tastes is itself idea, and beauty too is itself idea. Each develops in different concrete properties and domains, yet the comparison of how far they reach in the ideal general form is possible. This is how taste is to be measured as aesthetic taste, the correspondence to the idea of beauty. Because beauty is the sensuous presentation of his highest standpoint, that which he calls the idea, taste for the beautiful concerns a taste for freedom itself as presented in intelligible sensuous forms, and insofar as one is free in mind and body, this taste fully penetrates beyond a mere conscious rationality and becomes the rationality of the natural, psychological, intellectual, and cultural being of the individual self itself. We are capable, therefore, of appreciating beauty only to the extent that we ourselves are ideally constituted and determined in body, and most importantly in our psychological and intellectual consciousness. Because the idea is freedom, because we ourselves are a form of the idea, and because beauty is also a form of the idea, our taste for beauty is limited by our own achievement of freedom. Such freedom is nothing simple. It is of immense complexity, which in part we cannot even fully be conscious of, nor change through mere will. On abstract taste and determinate taste. No one has abstract taste and desires. There is no abstractly universal taste or abstract desire. There is only the potential of determining these more concretely. Humans have general taste, forms of desire which are immediately to be determined in entering the life world. We desire food, which is immediately the mother's milk. Later we have the need for arts, which are our cultural norms, etc. Though one may say they have a taste for rock music, the truth of the matter is that they like this or that particular rock subgenre, this or that individual band, this or that individual song. Of all the rock songs that exist, there are plenty that even the most ardent rock fanatic simply has no interest in or cannot stand. But why this or that taste for anything? Why do we have taste for music, paintings, architecture, and so on? There is a sense in which it is a need, a desire, yet we all know that there are people that seem to lack this need. There are those who care nothing for art, or at least for particular arts. This lack of taste is itself a determination of taste, but there is some argument to be made that it is not a taste for an aesthetic art, even if it is a taste for an aesthetic. As such, this particularly negative aesthetic won't be considered further in this piece. Taste is a seemingly immediate judgment of the senses that what is before them is good, that is desirable, or not. Yet why this should be the case is unknown. It seems only because aesthetic judgment is limited here to the senses of sight and sound with regard to a notion of natural beauty. And in such judgment, it is easy enough to find a pleasure or disgust response with little to no conscious cognition of any reason for such. We find in aesthetic judgment the satisfaction of a desire which we do not know we have, a satisfaction which in certain kinds of beauty we do not even have any cognizance as to what it is that it satisfies. This is why the aesthetic judgment is conceived by the likes of Kant as disinterested, for there seems to be no prior underlying reason or desire which would explain beauty as instrumental. We enjoy beauty for its own sake, and not because it satisfies a utilitarian purpose for something else. So how could there be an implicit desire behind taste? Desire is in many ways the wrong term, for on the one hand, what shall be pondered concerns the affinity or resonance of a kind of subject and a kind of object, an unconscious or objective recognition as well as a conscious and subjective one. On the other hand, desire is a not too unfitting concept in relation to taste, for what resonates in consciousness in the spiritual realm of the mind with the encountered beautiful object correlates strongly with the deepest desires of the self. What we are necessarily structures how and what we desire and how we are satisfied. What we want to be, what we believe in and aspire, what we think, necessarily structures how and what we desire and how we are satisfied. As such, the question of our taste lends itself momentum to push us into the questions of our determinate desires and satisfactions. The human being has a need insofar as they are constituted to a level of development which posits such a need. Many animals do not need recognition, let alone recognition through mediated metaphysical social phenomena such as art, religion, and philosophy. The pleasure of beauty is only for one whose sensuous and cognitive capacities unite with their positive affects to come together as one experience. The absolute spiritual need of the human is recognition. One would be hard-pressed to deny that the overwhelming origin of taste is a determinate form of recognition. Take, for example, the businessman who values money as capital, particularly its relative number against those with less, and proclaims business beautiful. Any scheme that succeeds in increasing their capital, no matter how superficially stupid and grotesque, is beautiful precisely because it sensuously presents to them the idea of capital. A car dealer sees their car lot full with the hot new cars of the year as beautiful precisely because this is the image of their capital. Their capital is the determinate existence of their conception of what it is to be truly recognized. That is, their success in generating more and more money is the measure of how they and others in society are to be esteemed and valued. For this businessman, it is undeniable that their taste has been shaped by how they conceive and understand their social worth as well as how to achieve it. Someone that grasps the world as efficient mechanism, efficient for what, one may ask, such as a technocrat, may see a parking lot as ugly simply because it is not efficient enough compared to a metro system. Someone that conceives the world as Gaia, a living organism, and as the world, sees a parking lot as ugly because it is a negation of the world's living unity, a creation of human ignorance and self-conceit to attempt to overcome nature by denying even dirt a place in life. Externally conditioned taste. The arbitrary pleasures and disgusts of nature soon give way to a determination in accord with what is at hand to satisfy a need. We need substance. But if all that is available to us is fruits, berries, nuts, and leaves, we shall of necessity need to eat them. By mere force of habit, our taste shall be shaped around what is available to the tongue, but the tongue is not alone determined to have a taste for such. The entire digestive system comes into a homeostasis of a specific kind which develops an entire microbiome in the gut with its flora and fauna fully specialized for and through a specific diet. The measure of good and bad tasting things seems to finally be determined by what the tongue and the entire digestive system has habituated to and primed itself for. Were one to grow up eating nothing but fruits, vegetables, and bread, one would overwhelmingly find meat a rather strange taste, if not outright disgusting. But more importantly, one would find that the body itself would reject the food even if the tongue found it pleasant. This is a well-known phenomenon attested to by anyone that travels widely among very different cultures. One does not simply eat anything commonly eaten in a foreign land. To do so is to invite many a food poisonings at worst, and many a days running to the toilet at usual. The change of the tongue's tastes and the body's change in being able to digest certain foods is also a commonly reported experience by those who make a proper shift in diet long term. A former philosophy instructor of mine in college had shifted her family's diet away from artificial sugar and towards vegetarianism. After 2 years, she said she could not stand the sugary taste of soda, and the taste of meat was beginning to become a distaste. Another and broader example is that anyone in Mexico or Thailand is expected by cultural norm to eat chili-spiced foods, which non-spice eaters simply find intolerable and torturous. The acquiring of the taste for spice, one that is not natural and initially causes recoil and displeasure, comes about through a culturally demanded need to manifest qualities that we find desirable because others recognize such. This is all to say one thing. The body's constituting condition from outside is empirically, and more importantly, logically, known to transform into the body itself. Habit forms the self, which is the origin of taste. Forced mastery transformed into taste. One can come to have a taste for things initially despised. One can find pleasure in things originally torturous for no other reason than that through the development of mastery, one cannot help but find satisfaction in the opening of the avenues of power, new degrees of freedom, new domains of determinations, where prior there had been nothing. A person forced to learn to play the piano virtuously may come to despise the instrument and its sound initially, even for decades. But in due time, without willing, will find that they cannot stand a wrong note, they cannot stand wrong finger techniques, they cannot stand sloppy playing, and that the sound of their yearnings is the instrument they once despised. In other words, they will find that they acquired taste, at least for technicalities of piano playing, and even a taste for the aesthetic sound itself, if for no reason, then that this is the sound which they can produce to express what wells up within them. With foods, one may, with habit, come to acquire a taste for healthy food and come to distaste of much of our unhealthy fast junk food. And so one may rightly say that in some manner one has acquired a superior taste on an objective level of healthy eating. The transformation of mastery into pleasure and taste is not rare. In fact, this very author has experienced it with the art of writing, which they once despised, yet now love, since it has become the prime medium of the expression of many things valued. Unnatural taste. The notion that taste is merely a natural endowment is at once comforting, yet it is also at once alarming in its restriction. Such endowments, gifted here and there according to the contingents of nature, are not, for being endowed differently, also equal in their capacities and merits. Certain individuals begin their life experience with senses developed to peculiar perceptive fineness, and minds determined in a way that takes pleasure in sensuous rationality. That is, some can grasp details of sight and sound which are missed out by most others. Along with this perceptive fineness may come a natural disposition to certain natural beauty, which is not impossible for anyone else, but which is a less powerful inclination for those who lack such fine perceptions. Spiritual or mental being finds pleasure in the realization of powers towards purpose. So in our natural powers, we find the impetus for the focus and development of these immediate powers into tastes given the opportunity and recognition. The subject's powers here are, again, not to be confused with merely conscious and unconscious matters within the psyche, but also with the very constitution of the mind. The further elaboration of such a taste, however, concern matters of the highest contingency in being gifts of chaotic nature, and so there is truly little else to be said which will directly illuminate the inquiry into the relation of taste and beauty. All that should be kept in mind is that natural tastes are not absolute, not final tastes, which we are doomed to any more than particular culture is something final which we cannot overcome. Internally conditioned taste. Taste is conditioned in its environment, but it is also in the end more strongly conditioned by its inner environment. Above was mentioned the fact that taste is determined as the body is itself reconstituted in its habituated consumption and reproduction. The body alters itself to deal physically and psychologically, effectively, with what it is given as a necessity. As the external natural condition or constitution of taste becomes the determination of taste, so too does the internal conscious condition do the same. One can will to have a taste for certain things despite the immediacy of the external body's recoil against what one has willed to taste. As an example, there's a Japanese dish known as natto, a kind of fermented soybeans. This is considered a traditional Japanese dish, but no one in their right mind begins with a natural taste for natto. No, like spicy peppers, one must will to subordinate and habituate the body to this taste in order to gain a taste for it. The will is internal to consciousness, yet it is not experienced as always internal to the subject's taste, which is the habituated physical and psychological body. The will is external to this tasting self when it turns against established habit, but must exert itself upon it as habit in order to penetrate into the core and so reshape it from outside in. In so doing, the conscious will proves itself Sorry. In so doing, the conscious will proves itself more internal and essential than the inertial body that had become the dormant self. The power to will oneself into a changed internal determination, which changes the entire domain of taste, goes beyond physical taste, but reaches its peak in the conscious and cognitive taste for and through ideas. The self, grasping its truth in an idea, attaches the positive aspects of the affects of the soul, the feelings to this idea and its embodiments. They who believe their essential truth as evil will perceive evil's sensuous presence as beauty. They who believe the opposite, that the essential truth is the good, will perceive the opposite. If power is the ultimate value, it is what I value, what I desire, and I find pleasure in encountering this truth in sensuous forms. Conceptual taste. Taste is so general a domain that it also concerns a taste for concepts. And so this abstract universality forms the very bridge that allows the expansion of taste within the universal or categorical domain into the sensuous domain and vice versa. To the extent to which the tasting subject achieves the realization of the idea, that is freedom, in concreteness, to that extent does taste reach for the highest forms of aesthetic appreciation. It must be repeated, the realization of the idea is not a purely cognitive state of conscious conceptual cognition, but includes the instantiation of the idea in the determination of the body and the determination of the psyche in a mature and experienced form. The limits of my cognitive, my psychological, and my conceptualizing freedom are the limits of my perception of beauty. In the taste for concepts, we find the possibility of uniting what seem completely opposite tastes, which should not be compatible in the usual mode of understanding. Ponder for a moment how one can love both fantasy and science fiction. One is mysticism, magic, and ancient wonderlands with metaphors for the world and its relation to God. One is rationalism, technoscience, and future imaginations of metaphors for the world and God's relation or reduction to man. If it were left merely to the immediacy of taste, one would like one or the other, or both, merely by the habituating acquaintance forced upon one in growing up with such aesthetics. But ponder that fantasy is interestingly a domain quite often tied to theism and the themes of the eternal and unchanging nature of things, while science fiction is tied to atheism and the themes of change and development. Both actually deal with the same concept from different yet valid sides. While in one the human is revealed within God's world and plan, in the other God is revealed within the human world and plan. In one, God has made himself human, in the other it is the human that shall or has made itself God. To have a taste for such contrasting domains of art is linked to the taste for the concept, which reveals the truth of the diametric connection of their concept as one differentiated unity. Of course, this is not how we experience this taste. One does not recognize a concept and judge then that the content has the proper form fit to our taste, but such recognition of a taste for this or that concept can arise in simple reflection, and an understanding of how or why we find contradicting tastes united can follow from much deeper reflections. But why do we have a taste for this or that concept? It is not conceptual reason alone, but because we are already in the idea where that concept corresponds, and we are already in it because we are it. For example, one who is good, a contentious concept I know, gravitates to the concepts of the good and recognizes its instantiations with pleasure. Taste and enculturation. Consider the sound of the harmonica and the taste which finds satisfaction in it. One may appeal, yes, to the mere quality of the sound as pleasing or displeasing, and most would simply leave it at that. But there is more to be said about displeasure or displeasure. The harmonica features prominently in the American Western. It is part of the cultural myth of the West, contingently on account that it was an instrument that was cheap and portable, something to entertain and give some spiritual expression to the cowboys who spent their time roaming alone days on end herding cattle. Be it as it may that this sound connects to this Western aesthetic as a contingency, its peculiar sound does not simply historically correlate, but really does feel this way. The quality of the harmonica sound itself simply is the quality of sounding this loneliness, this rough and rugged simple reality. One should not forget that aside from the Western, the blues took on the sound of the harmonica for sounding a very similar loneliness, not in the empty plains, but in the empty valleys, empty alleys, muggy bars and jail cells of grimy cities and railroad boxcars. Yet, to be even more general, is the Western itself the aesthetic of this concrete experienced reality of wandering loneliness? It would seem not. In fact, one must dare to declare it is not. It is a particular form of this reality. There is or can be an Indian. Have you heard that bamboo flute? A Chinese, a Javanese, a Sioux, etc. Sound and genre that corresponds to a close but not individually identical reality. But given that we are born and raised in the West, grow up with some Westerns, may conceive and understand the world through the Western, it is contingently necessary that the Western and its harmonica are the aesthetic expression of such a lonely reality for many within it. The universal desire and need is the expression of rugged loneliness and wandering. The particular taste is satisfied by the presence of a cultural aesthetic which provides this expression. Under normal conditions, the natural tendencies of taste are bent into shape by what society provides, and in this are bent yet again by individuals who desire other content, yet have no or know no other form. But not all loneliness and wandering are the same. Not all have the Western aesthetic as their proper expression. There is a kind of sadness whose quality only the violin expresses, another which only the electric guitar does, another which only the sitar does, etc. The emo aesthetic, though lonely, cannot accept the harmonica sound as its expression. It is too simple and rugged. It is incapable of expressing the notes with the right character and explicitness of a kind of pain which is not the pain of a lone wanderer in the prairies and plains of the soul. The reality of the emo is dark pain and must be expressed in the totality of their aesthetic from look to sound. Black overwhelms their presentation, pain their lyrics and poems, sadness and a very different kind of energetic loneliness is their sound, a strange contradiction of the vitality of this pain. The harmonica sound is above all too antiquated in the loneliness it presents. It is the sound of a bygone era, a world no longer existent or experienced by most. The community of its experience no longer exists, and where it remains, it is not the experience of the emo. Not even the harmonica and the blues genre can express this loneliness and sadness for the emo, though it is a more recent and still living aesthetic for a sizable number. Why? Because, again, it is neither the enculturated sound of the life of the emo, nor does it have the proper sound for what the emo feels. Of course, the harmonica isn't merely an instrument to play sad tunes with. There's plenty of party energy to be expressed in a tiny instrument, yet it retains its rugged character. Furthermore, even if the harmonica dominated the landscape of cultural background, one can expect it to be a short-lived life in the modern day. For merely 2 decades did the guitar and the electric guitar overwhelmingly dominate Western taste, followed on by ever-varied synthesizers. With the rise of music like rap, the focus shifted immensely away from instrumentation towards lyrical style and rhythm. With current pop music, things change just about every decade. Not only is the landscape of life ever-changing materially and cognitively, but it is also simply the case that no matter what form music takes as a dominant expression of the zeitgeist, there is one certainty. We will get bored of it soon enough and seek something new. The development of taste. Though we may determine that it is desires and needs that find individual satisfaction of taste in beautiful things of different kinds and different modes, this does not itself explain how taste relates to beauty objectively. The proper explanation does not actually immediately concern the relation to beauty itself, but to the essence of which beauty is only one mode, the idea, or absolute freedom and self-determination and self-comprehension. So, we now return to our opening quote by Blake. As a man is, so he sees. Taste versus beauty. Taste is a constant for the idea of the empirical contingent self, and beauty is a constant for the idea in sensuous appearance. Their relation, however, is through what unites both on a common relating ground. Their partaking in the idea, or rather, their actualizing and embodying of it. To the extent that I am idea, to that extent do I perceive and experience beauty. Because taste is necessarily my taste, and my taste is necessarily embedded within a culture, and furthermore, my taste for individual works of art depends on the constitution and development of myself as an integrated physical, psychic, and cognitive being, and because I am finite, I cannot expect to achieve perfectly universal taste at all moments, that is, a taste for all forms of beauty from lowest to highest at all times. When I am in the depths of baseness and in internal turmoil unknown to me, I have a taste for this and despise the higher things. When I am developed and mature, I taste after only the finer and higher, grow a distaste for the base as vile. Though I may in each come to a conscious comprehension of beauty, and may readily admit it must be present, and in its explanation I may find appreciative pleasure in its meaning and symbolism, these sensuously mean little, if anything, to my aesthetic taste. In this one finds the concept as pleasure, but not the beautiful itself. This is not the proper grasp of beauty, for beauty is not a purely theoretical creature. Beauty is sensuousness. It is felt and intuited as well as understood, and its success or failure addresses itself both to heart and mind. Taste, accordingly, changes as the person changes, develops as the person develops, and comes and goes as the person is in need or receptivity to certain forms of beauty. What was beautiful a decade ago rarely remains as beautiful today. What entrances us tomorrow will hardly entrance us the day after, when we have satisfied the desire which craved that expression and had our fill and grown bored of contemplating it. What for one holds attention all of life, for another is but a passing fixation for a few weeks, and is soon lost to the shadows of memory, only to be remembered once in a while as something we like, yet which at the living moment holds no draw for us. Yet, for all this, there are ways in which once matured, taste does not change from one object to another, but rather expands and moves within a larger and deepening plane of aesthetic experience. It is possible, indeed, it is actual, that one may be cognizant of beauty despite initially lacking its appreciation. But this requires that we recognize that beauty is indeed the idea in sensuous form, and that its perception cannot be limited to what I perceive in my immediacy of pleasure. Though I cannot feel your pleasure or interest in some artwork or naturally beautiful thing, I can understand and comprehend why it appears so to you, and why this itself is proof for what you perceive, that what you perceive is no fiction, but a truth sensuously presented. In my affinity for this truth, I may well find an opening to habituate my sensing to experience the pleasure of such new works and forms of art. Growing taste. With taste as such, we have something which can be trained and developed to a large extent, shaped by habituation through exposure, but more importantly, through personal growth. The question of developing taste as such is, as the whole discussion so far has shown, a rather foolish notion. One cannot abstract something about themselves called taste and work upon it specifically and independent of other matters of the self, for there is no such thing existent in us. The development of taste is constituted by elements of the self which are in themselves not for the sake of taste. In this matter, it is a matter of misunderstanding to pose questions of how to develop one's taste as if taste is itself an end to be sought to develop. Taste is a synthetic unity of developments which are not for the sake of taste, whereas the developments of beauty are specifically for the sake of beauty. There can be no teaching of taste whatsoever. There can only be the provision of the conditions of developing taste through giving individuals the context of self-development in general. The development of taste comes only in the wake of the development of personality, and the development of personality comes only in the wake of the organic development of its elements, a development which is neither uniform across individuals nor within an individual themselves. Some mature emotionally faster than others, some intellectually, some all around, etc. Though there is, and most likely can be, no science for generating personal development, we find nonetheless that there is such development, and that it indeed leads to developments of taste. The first and prime example of the fact of this development is nothing other than the development of a child into an adult. The tastes of a child accord with their limitations, ones which can grasp neither the depths, heights, or dimensions of the much more complicated experience and knowledge of an adult. The immediacy and simplicity of what children find pleasure in with art is such that the meaning of art is itself beyond them. Take, for example, a classic piece of art for children, The Little Prince. A child may find the story and its characters endearing, but they do not comprehend many of the truths presented, not because they are not apparent, but because the child simply lacks the capacity to perceive these due to lack of experience and development. An adolescent can turn to these works and glean much more, and an adult even more. Now, take an example of something which was in its run very popular entertainment art, but not fine art. Naruto, an anime series. Naruto as a series is deep to children and teens. Certainly it is true that there are concepts which are apparent in everything from the general structure to specific characters and events, but such entertainment art, which is the entertainment first and art second, breaks under the pressure to perform. Formulas of plot are used, complications are contrived and manufactured to keep things fresh, even if minimally meaningful. Coherence is lost and internal logic broken. The attempt to escalate ever more makes for great moments of amnesia, in order that a challenge is not over. Sorry, let me repeat that. The attempt to escalate ever more makes for great moments of amnesia in order that a challenge is not overcome by obvious and simple solutions already presented long before, etc. Basically, children's cartoons are a mess enjoyed for reasons that are aesthetic in a pure sense of pleasure in their outlandishness and surprise. We like to be entertained. Who doesn't? But entertainment too has developments. At some point, we need things to not be. Uh, sorry. At some point, we need things to be not simply more complicated, but coherent and logically consistent in order to suspend our disbelief of the artwork presenting an abstraction. At some point, we have moved on, and the old and simpler has at last become boring. The very fact of the existence and conceivability of boredom is itself a most interesting metaphysical truth which arises from and yields the infinite determination of the absolute as a finality without finality, an endless end. From an adult experiential and intellectual standpoint, these kinds of artworks are just not good enough to satisfy our aesthetic needs. This is not because adult art must be dark and gritty, sexual and violent, but because the true adult has much higher demands of concretion and depth to enjoy an artwork. The presentation of love to an adult is very different to that of a child's. It is far more complicated, far more concrete, far more subtle, far more mediated. Much of what comes to appear as obvious flaws in works aimed at children are nothing but shortcuts made on the true assumption that children simply do not cognize the broken leaps of movement as broken when the entertainment is good enough for them where it matters, the flashiness. A proper artwork, even if made for children, is properly developed in its subject matter and reveals its infinite determination to the inquiring mind. On the teaching of taste. The tastes for beauty and art are seen much the same way as Hegel describes in the earlier quote. As a matter of habit, we are exposed through our growing phase to works of art considered important in our culture in hopes that this exposure itself will, as if by osmosis, enter us and constitute a basis of good or high taste. We find, however, that for many this does nothing but bore and repulse them in being forced to encounter works that do not yet call to them. In the attempt to impart taste, distaste is also imparted, for what is presented of art is at first alien to most individuals. They either do not recognize the actual life world in it, they do not recognize any interest or problems of their own in such works, or they do not feel any familiarity with the medium of the work since it is not a mode which they are accustomed to. If individuals are so lucky as to remember later in life and turn to these old books, shows, or films to give them another chance, they often find that they no longer find these works so boring. They do not despise nor find these works meaningless. What has changed? They have developed as a self. They have grown into the qualities and capacities which now enable the recognition of beauty in these works, where before only an empty form was present without any meaningful content. The development of taste through enculturation, however, does not fully equip us to come to universal capacities of recognition. No matter how we try to enculturate our taste, no matter how diverse and varied, it never rises to universality because living culture is limited, and so is the exposure of the life of the mind. And if we let judgment of taste be based on this mere habituation of desire dictate our knowledge of beauty, we shall not recognize it when our taste trails behind it. It is for this reason that beauty's standard is not taste. It has an intelligible concept which is its own objective form. Concretely, universal taste. There is not and never has been, history bears witness, a single aesthete with broad taste who did not have a taste for universal ideas. An open mind is ultimately a prerequisite to open taste. An open mind itself not an abstract void, which lets anything fall in, not just as quickly and let me read that. An open mind itself is not an abstract void which An open mind is itself not an abstract void which lets anything fall in and just as quickly fall out, but a progressive ideal which is always seeking to build itself higher and broader with any and all forms of reason which shine with a form of truth, the divine idea. The simple dogmatist grows with their local notions and visuals, attaches themselves to it, and recoils in disgust with anything that dares to claim equality and validity alongside it, let alone superiority. They who grasp universals, however, look upon foreign works with excitement and glee in seeing truth appear in the individual works of a foreign land and people with a drastically different appearance and style. The jarring encounter is mediated by the universal, and the sensuous appearance gains endearment as the self accepts and reshapes itself in trying to be charitable to this new appearance of the universal. This does not at all require lofty ideals such as God, but literally can be anything, even the lowly notion of partying hard. The constitution and determination of the self in light of ideals is the movement of integration and appreciation of the difference of the same and the sameness of the different. As a social form moves ever outward, it comes to integrate an entire aesthetic world to itself. The ultimate artistic paradigm can be viewed as two things: the free fusion of all forms of art and the commingling purity of all forms of art, none of which are to be excluded in the zeitgeist at large. The upward spiral of social tastes. We begin with natural taste. Through our environment, we come to learn that what can realize the desires originating in these tastes and what cannot, and that which is distasteful can come to be desired through habit and vice versa. As we grow, we are habituated into the forms of culture. We are thus given content, forms which realize our indeterminate tastes in concrete form, and in so doing give our desire concrete form as well. Beauty, because it is cognitive and sensuous with a peak in art, cannot be disentangled from the general enculturation of a social zeitgeist. Nonetheless, the zeitgeist of beauty cannot remain static by the very nature of what we are as spiritual beings. Relentless, endless, and absolute negativity form the core of what it is to be what we are. It is the core which is freedom itself, freedom to self-determine, with no other purpose than to be free to self-determine. This itself is the idea, the truth of reality and what we are. The difference of natural gifts of body and material circumstance, concrete social life, and the life of the mind are nothing to the productive soul of life. Regardless of any single individual's success or failure, the totality of a social form of life of itself produces the presentation of all that is possible truth over its life. Though one generation falls into complacency and repetition, the next feels the urge to break forth into something new, and when allowed, moves erratically and frantically every which way, trying to find the proper form for the as of yet vague contents of its soul. The difference of taste is not simply in the difference of life in its concreteness, but in its vitality. It is the vital power of freedom which forever engenders inevitable boredom, as if by metaphysical decree. Be bored and perish, or create and survive. It is therefore the highest taste which can itself desire this ultimate fact of freedom, the desire to see the infinite determination of beauty in all its ugliness, in all its chaos, in all its fantastic, grandiose aspirations. I am here reminded of the eclectic Frank Zappa. Boredom sets in, and the gems that stand out are those few that manage to break on through to the other side, the side which is the future's truth announced in the present, a future that we often find was announced in the echoes of eternity long past. If philosophy is the owl that flies at dusk, beauty is the flower that blossoms with the peak of dawn. Like nature, it grows wherever fertile, valiantly it strives even if futile, and gallantly it rests upon its rainbow fields.